Hi there. Welcome to The Preventable, the podcast giving you a seat at the table with conversations about the intersection of alcohol, drugs, and mental health in everyday lives. Take a seat and join us.
All right, y'all. We are back with another episode of In the Weeds. These are like mini episodes where we dig into different issues relating to cannabis because, let's face it, there's a lot to sort through and there's a lot of information. So with me today is Jaidan Adams. She's Prevent+Ed's Director of Behavioral Health, and we're going to talk primarily about adults and the services that Prevent+Ed provides related to cannabis, but also like the services people are asking for. So let's dig in. So first of all, welcome, Jaidan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into all that stuff, I just want to talk a little bit about you. How long have you been with Prevent+Ed? I was trying to think this morning and I couldn't remember.
It's been 5 years as of July 31st, I believe.
Okay.
Yes.
And you were in the field long before you came to Prevent+Ed, right?
Yes. So right out of college, I started working at Preferred Family Healthcare as a community support specialist.
In Kirksville?
In Kirksville.
Okay.
And then I moved to St. Louis about 6 years ago. And so I continued my work, and I worked with adults in drug court. Really intense. And so it was a lot. And so I wanted a change. And I had remembered from working, so I started as the community support specialist, and then I went to a prevention specialist at Preferred, and I had remembered from meeting NCADA there, and so when I was looking for a change, I'm like, this would be perfect. I've already done this kind of work, so that's what brought me here.
I remember when folks met with you and were interviewing they're like, okay, we will probably need to create a hodgepodge position for Jaidan because she's good with students. I think that's what we were actually maybe looking for at the time was prevention education. You could talk to students, but you also weren't scared of adults, which is really nice to have people who can do both, right? And you had kind of some coalition work. You had already been, I want to say, were you already trained in mental health first aid?
Yeah, I think a big draw was I was trained in SAPST and youth mental health first aid. So there was a lot. Yeah.
Yes. So we're like, okay, we're going to create a position for Jaidan. And so you were sort of had your feet in a lot of different buckets. But then, one day you came to me and you're like, okay, I'm like ready for more. And so then you really leaned into the, for lack of a better word, like the counseling or now the behavioral health side of things. And that's really what you've been doing for the last couple of years. And now you're leading the department.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I started, it was funny because my background is not in education at all.
Mine neither.
But it was substance use. And so I knew how to talk about it. I just kind of had to learn how to talk to young people about it.
Right.
And so it was really more of that kind of education piece that I had to learn, like classroom management and stuff like that. But yeah, and then I just
you learned
gravitated
quick
towards
though,
counseling.
because you were one of the people that when funders would want to see what we did, like, okay, let's see what Jaidan's up to. Let's come watch her. So you learned very quickly.
Yeah, nothing more nerve-wracking than that.
I'm sure to have like your boss and like a funder. Yeah, exactly. Awkward, but
always goes great.
You did. Yes. You always did great.
Thank you.
So we had Presley on to talk about Guided and the work she's doing with young people, teenagers in particular, who are starting to experiment with substances, who maybe don't meet the criteria for a cannabis use disorder, but are really starting to kind of dabble. Their adults are freaking out, getting in trouble at school, and you oversee that program and work with Presley on that. Really, the main work that you are really doing right now is really working with adults, right?
Yes.
So, big picture, let's take cannabis and set it aside, but big picture, could you talk about like the types of folks that come for the types of adults that come for our assessment and referral services?
Yes. I would say about 90% of them are justice involved.
Say that for the...
They're coming from probation or parole.
Okay.
So typically if they have probation or parole at least once during that period, they have to get a substance use assessment. It could just be right when they start. It could be that they test positive for something and that's why they're coming to us, but at least once over the course of their probationary period. And then I would say about another 5% comes from employers. So thinking about if there's a workplace accident, or even if they're hiring somebody and they test positive for something, they'll have them get an assessment. And then the other 5, I would say, are self or really kind of family referrals. So just referring a loved one that they're having concerns about their use.
Can you talk a little bit about what the assessment process looks like? Even like going from like beginning when they make a call or connect online all the way up to like when they meet and finish, like what they walk out of the office with. Like kind of talk through the process if you don't mind.
Yeah, so typically we get calls from people setting up an assessment, like I said, mostly from probation or parole. And so once...
Do they call themselves, or does the probation or parole officer call?
They will call themselves.
Because they have to, right?
Yes.
It's part of like, okay.
This
like,
is a requirement.
Right. You're fishing now. Like,
yes.
You need to do this. Okay.
Yes. So they call, we get them scheduled, typically within a few weeks.
Okay.
And then initially...
Usually we try for like 2 weeks, right?
Yes.
Like, okay.
Yeah. Right now we have somebody out on parental leave, so maybe a little bit longer, but
give them some grace.
Yes. But we work with people to get them in as soon as possible.
I'm also going to interrupt you and just like clarify that we're not emergency services.
Correct.
Right? So this is not somebody who is detoxing and really needs to get into treatment. That is not what Prevent+Ed does. You could assist and get them a warm handoff, but that's not what you do.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I did get a call from a loved one who it was a crisis situation, I'm honest with them and just say this assessment would be pointless.
Right.
We already know their level of use is to the point that we need some treatment services. So then it would be let's nix the assessment and look at what are some local treatment services that we could offer.
And that would meet your needs based on income, insurance. Do they need inpatient, outpatient? Do they have a job that they can't leave? What substance are they using? Because obviously if somebody is like using fentanyl, that's a little bit more of a crisis than somebody who's using like cannabis.
Yes.
Just as an example.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So we are not talking about emergency situations.
Right.
We're talking about folks that are employer mandated, perhaps, or people who are on probation or parole who are calling. Okay. So they call or they contact you via email.
So they schedule an assessment, and then we send an initial confirmation email, and that has some pre-paperwork with it. The first part is just demographic information, and then the last piece of it is just some different assessment tools. So assessing their readiness for change, assessing how much alcohol they drink, how much of other substances that they use. And so it determines their level of use, and then we have a database that we can put that information in, and it'll, flag if there is a concern about their drinking, if it's looking like it's maybe harmful drinking versus dependence. So it kind of helps us out in that way. I will say probably 50% of people don't fill that out ahead of time.
Okay.
And that's almost it. Sometimes it's nice because if you think about setting up an assessment, people just throwing paperwork at you, like when people come in person and let's say they haven't had their paperwork filled out, totally fine. I will have them fill out the demographic piece just because some of that information is a little sensitive. They don't really want you asking them.
Sure.
So I'll have them fill that out, and then I'll say, listen, I know you see like 60 other questions. Don't overwhelm yourself with that. Come into my office and let's walk through this together. And people have been so receptive to that. They're like, thank you for not just shoving paperwork in my face and having that be the whole assessment, because that's what they kind of think of when they think of assessment. And that's why when I'm walking through that paperwork with them, I'll tell them, this is nice because if you were to just hand me this paperwork, if we didn't have this conversation piece of it, I could look at this paperwork and think something totally different. But when I actually talk to you and we have a conversation, then I can better understand what the situation is and then what are your needs, what is the best next steps.
Yeah, I think when people hear the word assessment, they automatically think it's like some sort of test, or at the end they're going to get some sort of grade, right? Like, I am am an alcoholic. Like, you're going to like tell me what I am.
Yes.
Whereas with the assessments that Prevent+Ed does, you know, because they're unbiased, they're, you know, we're not trying to tell you to go into one particular thing. You're also not, I mean, you're not diagnosing them.
Right.
It's really a conversation to figure out what do they need, if anything, what would stick.
Yeah.
And like, what's their level of acceptance, motivation, because you know that plays so much a part into it too. So, I mean, this conversation can really last like an hour and a half, right?
Yeah, some 2.5,
Yeah.
depending. Some people just want to talk, and that's
Right.
totally fine. And it's funny that you mentioned like the trying to like, sometimes our questions in the assessment form that we have now, there are some that are a little repetitive, like I'm not just thinking about changing my use. I've already changed some, or I want to change my use. And I've had that feedback where people are like, are you trying to trip me up? Or like, what am I supposed to? And I'm like, number one, I didn't write the assessment tool. Number two, we've taken that feedback and we actually shortened it from 60 questions to like maybe 40.
Love that.
Just so that it doesn't look like that. Because I totally get it. When I looked through it too, I'm like, gosh, it does kind of look like we're trying to like catch people in a lie or something. And it's like, that is totally not what this is. And again, even if people have done the paperwork beforehand, once they have the conversation side of it, they're like, oh, okay, you're not just taking this paperwork as face value.
And people to come in, I mean, just they're not going through metal detectors. We don't have video cameras. We have really comfy chairs. We even many times will offer them like refreshments. Like, for many people, what we hear is that it's a very different experience than what they've experienced before, if they've ever had to do something like this. And that's intentional, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we try to make it a super comfortable experience. And a lot of people will come in and they're like, I was a little nervous about this. And I'm like, take a deep breath. Do not be nervous. You're talking to me. Like, it's going to be just fine. So I feel
I look like I'm 10.
Yeah.
I can't make you nervous.
I probably sound like I'm 10 too. I was saying earlier that I feel like I sound very young. But no, we do just try to make them.
We don't take ourselves too seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. And we just try to make them as comfortable as possible. And that way they feel, you know, willing to open up. And they understand right away that it's not punitive. Like, it's not meant to be punishment.
That's right.
It's literally just to determine your level of use and determine what are your needs, if any, because some people, they're just fine.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so after this conversation, depending on the situation, they might leave with a piece of paper, right, that then they're taking to their school if it's a young person, employer, parole officer, whatever, right? And all of this is $25 if they can afford it.
Yes, correct.
And if not, we figure it out.
And I've heard that's very, in comparison to other assessments, $25 has been really well received. So.
And if somebody comes in who is not a English speaker, then what happens?
We have interpreter services that we can use virtually, in person, either way.
Okay. So talk to me a little bit about what you've seen with use and drugs of choice the last couple of years. Like, is it alcohol? Is it cannabis? Is it Oxycontin? Like, what is it, Jaidan?
Well, it's so funny you brought me on the In the Weeds podcast.
Weird,
I know.
right?
I would say 90% of adults who are referred are because they are on probation or parole and they're testing positive for THC. Same with the employer referrals. It is the majority of the time THC. And I've had some, not a ton, but some people recently stating that they've only used cannabis products, but they've tested positive for cocaine has been the most recent.
Interesting. So if you... okay, I'm trying to think how to ask this question, but like, okay, so if I'm on parole and I test positive for THC, what does that mean really? Does that mean that I am going back to jail? Does that mean that you're going to tell me that I need to go to treatment? Does that mean that I'm addicted to cannabis? Like, what does that mean?
That is a wonderful question. And honestly, the what happens next has been super confusing because honestly, across the board, it's inconsistent. And that's what's made me kind of want to pull my hair out is like, what is the expectation? Because yes, legally, we know that the expectation is that if you're on probation or parole, you are not to use any substances. We also know that probation officers don't want to put people in prison for smoking cannabis.
Right.
And so, and what's confusing for a lot of people is that you can use a substance without having a substance use disorder. And I think that probation and parole officers and employers understand that. I even had an employer the other day, he had his employee schedule the assessment, and he actually called separately to kind of like vouch for the employee, saying, you know, hey, they tested positive for THC. He's worked with us for 20 years. We've never had an issue. We are requiring this assessment. And then it's like once you talk to that individual, maybe they were out one weekend and they used it. I've had a lot of people who they're like, you know, I take a hit or two off of a joint before bed to help me go to sleep. And so it's like if we're talking about a substance use disorder, there are certain criteria that somebody has to meet for that. And a lot of the people don't. And so to me, of course, as a substance use counselor, my recommendation for you to be the healthiest version of yourself is not using any illicit substances, including cannabis. But I'm also a human, and I'm realistic. And we know that people who use are still going to use, especially if they're not experiencing consequences from that. So when people tell me, hey, I tested positive for THC, I always ask, what'd your PO say? Did they give you a violation? Did they threaten going back to prison? And they're like, well, they just told me to come get this assessment done. And then it doesn't sound like maybe they're doing future drug testing. Or some of them have been told if it's just THC that pops up, that's totally fine. So it's it's confused me because I'm what's my role here? I am recommending that they don't use it, but then I'm also having the conversation of harm reduction. So again, if somebody's going to use, they're going to use. So let's talk about safer use. Where are you getting it from? Are you getting it from a dispensary or a friend down the street? How much are you using? I've had a lot of people, when we really talk about it, they're like, yeah, I spend too much money on it. And so, okay, if you're spending $100 a week, let's talk about $70, like just a little bit less. That way it is safer. They're using less. They're benefiting from it. But it's just been so confusing for me as far as like, what am I putting in these official court letters?
Totally.
Yeah.
And if it's confusing for you, a person who has a bunch of letters behind your name, who's been in this field for a long time, who, you know what you, like, if it's confusing for you, obviously it is confusing for someone else.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's part of what we've been trying to do with these In the Weeds episodes and the whole campaign is like, this is complicated.
Yes.
And it's complicated from a legal perspective. It's complicated from a medical versus recreational or adult use. It's complicated with ages. It's complicated with the products and the potency. And so if it's complicated for us, of course it's complicated for a person who is on probation and parole and is trying to do the very best that they know how and is potentially trying to cope with certain things, or maybe they just were, like took a hit off of something. And it does not, to your point, mean that they have a full-fledged cannabis use disorder. It might mean that they, made a decision.
There's a huge difference between somebody smoking an excessive amount in a day. It's interfering with their daily life.
Correct.
It's impacting work, their finances, relationships, all the above. But I've also seen the other side of it where, like, I met this woman who was 3 years abstinent from heroin and fentanyl.
Wow.
Which is awesome. And
amazing.
I was, no pun intended, I was gassing her up, being like, yes, this is awesome.
This is
good
amazing.
for you. That's amazing. And then as we're going through the assessment a little bit more, and I start asking about cannabis, I ask, do you use any other substances? Do you drink alcohol? Do you smoke weed? And I could see her shoulders drop. And she was like, yeah, I smoke weed before bed. Because to her, she's not in recovery because she smokes weed. But it's no, you're in remission from a substance use disorder. You have controlled use right now. That doesn't mean you're a failure. It doesn't mean you're not in recovery. It means that you're using a substances within control, yet you are on probation.
Right.
So legally,
right.
And that's where it's so confusing. It's I am supposed
yes.
to tell you to stop. And honestly, to be your healthiest version, you should, because we know there's so many effects. There's carcinogens. It affects your brain, your memory. So yes, I recommend that you stop, but I don't want you to feel like you're a failure because
right.
you smoke before bed.
Right. And it's some people might be listening to this, really hardcore preventionists might be listening to this and be like, whoa, this is a bridge too far.
Yeah.
And we're not encouraging cannabis use.
Exactly.
We're also talking about adults.
Mm-hmm.
If we were having a conversation about youth, it would be a very different conversation. We are talking about adults, and right now in the state of Missouri, it is legal for adults.
Mm-hmm.
It might be, a violation of a business policy or a violation of parole, but again, to be honest, what's legal at the federal level and the state level not matching is confusing for average people.
Yes.
It just is. Okay. Yeah. And again, if it's confusing for us, of course it's confusing for other people.
Yeah.
I have to tell you a funny story. So my new job is funded. One of the main funders is the Alabama Department of Mental Health, and they require anybody working under their contracts to get drug screened.
Oh.
Jaidan, I have not had a drug test for 20 years, okay? Because at Prevent+Ed, fun fact, we do not require drug screens. People might be saying, how is that possible? Well, we're a recovery-friendly workplace. We take people at their word. Okay, so we don't drug screen.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 weeks in, I have to, which it should have been pre-employment. Just kidding. Pre-employment, I am getting ready to take a drug screen. And I freak out because the night before my drug test, I was at a concert.
Oh, gosh.
And it was a T-Pain concert, okay? Am I painting a picture here? And I'm like, oh, my God, I'm going to have a contact high.
Yeah.
And I'm going to test positive, and I'm not going to get this job, and it's going to make the news, and it's going to be, and I go nuts, okay? I don't get much sleep. I go that morning to the drug testing place, which is pretty much what they do is do the drug tests. And it was like a factory.
Yeah.
Okay. They were churning it out. There were no resources on substance use.
Wow.
I've since reached out to them to see if they would want any. I have not heard back. It was a factory. Okay. Now, cutting here to the end, I did not test positive for substances. I'm still employed. I still have a job. But I'm just thinking, what an opportunity to educate, to be supportive, to say, okay. Because you knew, people would walk in and you knew the looks of feeling of dread on their face.
Oh.
You knew that it was dun, 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 that they were going to get in trouble. They were going to lose their job. They were going to violate parole. You knew it.
Yeah.
And I just was oh my gosh, there has to be something better.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is, but it has to be something better.
Yeah.
And I lost so much sleep over it. And it was 2 days before my results came back. And I was just oh my God, I shouldn't have gone to that darn T-Pain concert.
That's the Office episode where Michael went to the, I think, Alicia Keys concert. And he thought he was going to fail a drug test.
That's what I feel like I am Michael Scott half the time. But I just could really empathize with people who probably knew they were going to test positive.
Yeah.
And then what that means for them and what that could mean for all the different things in their life. And it made me so incredibly grateful
Yeah.
for the services that Prevent+Ed provides, and what I know happens under your watch, where people are received and talked to in a way that is just open-hearted and like rational.
Yeah. And that makes me wonder too, like even with the employer who had the employee that tested positive that they respected so much, it's like, are you going to fire them for this one failed drug test,
right?
Or tested positive for
Yes,
THC,
right? But
it's like, are you going to fire this wonderful employee for maybe it was just a one-time thing?
Right.
And that's what I love, is that it sounds like employers, POs, they're giving people second chances.
Well, that's the whole recovery-friendly workplace
Yeah.
idea, right? Is that we don't have zero tolerance policies.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are exceptions. There are weird things that happen. There are like, okay, this person has been a longtime employee who we know has gone through hard times.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they came back with a positive drug test.
Mm-hmm.
And also they're more than that,
Yeah.
right? And so that's, I think, kind of the hope here, is that not, again, that we're encouraging use,
Right.
but that we're really trying to work with the individual and within the systems.
Mm-hmm.
Because you then do a lot of work with drug courts and
Yeah.
probation, like to try to sort of expand some awareness.
Mm-hmm. And I will give a shout out. I mean, a lot of employers use us. The St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department will send officers to us. And so it's like, that's amazing that you don't just fire people right off the bat. Yes, they tested positive for something, but let's have the conversation and determine, is our substances a problem in their life? And if not, let's work with them, work with an EAP program, work with us at Prevent+Ed, and, let's get this person back on their feet and back to being employed.
I'm so happy you came.
Yes.
I've learned a ton. I know other people did too. If people want to schedule an assessment or, want to just talk to you more about the process, or how can they start referring folks to Prevent+Ed, how do they reach you?
So you can reach me by email at jadams@prevented.org, or you can give us a call. I can give my personal dial pad number.
Yeah.
314-896-3504.
Thank you, Jaidan, for being on, for digging in the weeds. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, until next time, y'all. See ya.
Thanks for joining us at The Preventable, brought to you ad-free by Prevent+Ed. Prevent+Ed works to reduce or prevent the harms of alcohol and other drug use through education, intervention, and advocacy. Please visit their website at prevented.org. Like what you heard? Rate, review, and subscribe to stay up to date with what we are serving on The Preventable.